I've just been looking over this disturbing case from Iran. Young girl brutally murdered by her father. Very young girl. Um, it's really troubling. Actually, just collecting myself because I'm literally quite angry just thinking about it. And just a disclaimer: some of the details perhaps I'm going to be talking about here are sensitive, or in the sense that it's an unpleasant subject matter, but a very important one that needs to be discussed. So this is from the BBC article on the story. Police in Iran have arrested a man accused of murdering his 14-year-old daughter in a so-called honour killing that sparked widespread outrage. Romina Ashrafi ran away from home in Jilan province with her 35-year-old boyfriend after her father objected to their marriage, local media said. The pair were found by police and Romina was sent home despite reportedly telling them she feared for her life. Last Thursday night, she was allegedly attacked by her father in her bedroom. News outlet gilhabar.ir reported that Romina was decapitated with a sickle, and afterwards the father walked outside the house with the sickle in his hand and confessed. On Wednesday, a number of national newspapers highlighted Romina's story on their front pages. Insecure Paternal Home read a headline in the pro-reform Eptikar, which lamented the failure of existing legislation to protect women and girls. Meanwhile, the Persian hashtag Romina Ashrafi has been used more than 50,000 times on Twitter, most users condemning the killing and the patriarchal nature of Iranian society in general. Shaheen Dokt Molaferdi, a former Vice President for Women and Family Affairs and the current Secretary of Iran Society for Protecting Women's Rights, wrote, Romina is neither the first nor will she be the last victim of honour killings. She added that such murders will continue as long as the law and dominant cultures in local and global communities are not deterring enough. Iran's Islamic Penal Code reduces punitive measures for fathers and other family members who are convicted of murder and physically harming children in domestic violence or honour killings. If a man is found guilty of murdering his daughter in Iran, the punishment is between 3 and 10 years in prison, rather than the normal death sentence or payment of diya or blood money for murder cases. There are no statistics on the prevalence of honour killings in Iran, but human rights activists reported last year they continue to occur, particularly among rural and tribal populations, according to the US State Department. So, very disturbing case. I'll get to the issue about the father in a minute and the cultural side. Um, Admittedly, it's a bit questionable that her boyfriend's 35, which certainly in this country would be classed as predatory. I don't know what the background of that is. She's only 14. Um, but clear that she was frightened, and the fact the police sent her back means they are at least partly to blame. Now, a few things to point out. Um, many people in Iran, reformers, feminists, human rights activists, are very angry and upset about this particular case. It's a particularly savage one. Um, I mean, any sort of honor killing is brutal, but this is one of the worst I've heard, and I've heard of many over the years, not just in Iran and other countries as well. Um, it's very clear that the law is far too weak in dealing with the perpetrators. Between 3 and 10 years, even in an Iranian prison, that is pretty lenient when you consider that purported drug dealers, and that's been speculated to be a sort of cover for executing homosexuals, but purported drug dealers will get the instant death sentence. And wherever you think of the death penalty, clearly there's not a balance there. So a father can decapitate his daughter and he'll get between 3 and 10 years for this savage, evil crime. Um, it's really far too lenient. Um, President Rouhani apparently has called for the laws to change. When Rouhani came in, he was seen as a reformer, and if he really pushes this, he might prove his credentials to be a reformer. I'm not overly optimistic because, by Iranian standards, I say reform with a small r because um, it's still one of the worst countries in the world to be female, without question. Um, Now, there's been a debate around honor killings regarding Islam, with some saying it's an Islamic thing, others saying it's a cultural thing. I think probably it's a bit of both. Um, Historically speaking, other religions haven't exactly been squeaky clean on this either. But I think the focus on Islam is because it primarily occurs in Islamic majority countries. But, India is not totally devoid of it. Hinduism is not totally devoid of it. Um, but it does seem to be a very significant problem within Islamic societies. It seems to be a particular problem in Iran, parts of Pakistan, and other parts of South Asia and the Middle East. I think my gut feeling is it probably is more cultural than religious, but it is religion, Islam, that also protects the perpetrators through leniency, because in the distorted thinking of Islamic jurisdictions, brutally murdering a young girl is not as serious an offence as, say, being a dissident and you're accused of terrorism. That's considered a bigger offence, whether there's actual terrorism or not. But if you look at a case like this and you cannot feel disgusted or I don't know. Um, all I'll say is it just reminds us that the ridiculous politically correct notion that all cultures are equal is absolute nonsense. It's an absolute cardly, dishonest statement to make, because a culture that deems that it's okay to do this, and I'm aware there's a lot of Iranians who don't approve of this, they're angry about this, they're protesting about this, etc. But make no mistake about it, this man is not unique in his mentality. He's not some crazy guy who just done this because he's an evil man. He done it because he's a product of a society that thinks that is the right approach for dishonor. That he's entirely responsible for his own actions, and in my opinion, he should be thrown in jail for the rest of his life. But this should not be dismissed as just a one-off, because I can already predict people saying, "Oh, you can't say it's got anything to do with Iranian culture. You can't say it's oh, there's bad things happening everywhere." And they'll try to downplay it, and their only interest will be Iran's reputation. Even Iranian reformers sometimes seem to care more about their country's image than about the human rights abuses that go on there. The Iranians are very nationalistic. In a way, it's similar to what I've seen from some Chinese nationalists, where they'll say they don't agree with what the government does, but they'll fiercely defend the image of China. So if you're an Iranian reformer and you agree this is appalling, don't blame Western media. Don't say, "Oh, this is just the BBC or CNN making Iran look bad." Accept this is a problem in your midst. But it's a reminder of why we shouldn't be politically correct when it comes to culture. Not all cultures are equal. You simply cannot, in any rational sense of the word, compare this to Western liberal democracy, which in which there would also be anger, but that sort of mentality wouldn't be prevalent in the first place. If this happened, and it has, in fact, there's been cases in Britain of young Pakistani girls being killed in honor crimes. Um, but if this happened outside of those cultures, it would the person responsible would be seen as a sadist, a monster. Um, wouldn't be it wouldn't be deemed a cultural thing because it wouldn't be a cultural thing. It's just a fact. No matter how politically correct you want to be, that is a fact. I just cannot even begin to comprehend the it's totally alien to me as a way of thinking. How a man could kill a defenseless young girl, that he would be so angry, so enraged that he would do that. It just staggering. It defies comprehension. And he gave himself up. He didn't go on the run. That indicates he was either proud of what he'd done or he just kind of was so convinced that he'd done the right thing that he actually believed that justice would be on his side. And given the legislation that exists, 3 to 10 years, he's right, unless that radically changes. And here's the thing that is unavoidable: there would be many people in that culture who actually condone what he's done. They'll say, oh, well, she shouldn't have ran off. She dishonored her father. That's the sort of mentality that is out there. And it enrages me, quite honestly, when condemning this sort of thing is dismissed as racist. Because there is a small but vocal contingent of people who always frame every single thing through the prism of, call it what you want, white supremacy, or traffic the right term. But I cannot comprehend how anyone could not be angry by that and could try to be PC about it and say, oh, you have to respect all cultures. That is the most idiotic, cardly, virtue signaling thing I can think of people saying. Respect all cultures, tolerate all cultures. There are some occasions when there's certain things you can't tolerate. That's where tolerance becomes a silly word. Something like that should not be tolerated. And the fact of the matter is, in the Western liberal notion of unlimited multiculturalism, we see these sort of crimes happening, even in Western countries, albeit not as commonly, because the laws here are a lot stricter. But the the attitude to multiculturalism, that it's all about just tolerance and let's just treat all cultures equally, it is so very naive. I remember reading a case a few years ago, an Afghan migrant um, attempted to throw acid in his wife's face because she wasn't wearing her burqa. This was somewhere in the Midlands, and he felt she dishonoured him by doing that. I think that certainly in the context of Western countries, we need an immigration system that's. I don't advocate pulling up the drawbridge, but I would say that people from countries that are known to have this sort of problem need to be vetted. I don't see what's unreasonable about that or bigoted about that. When you have such a culture clash, when you have such a contrast in values, I don't see what's wrong with saying, okay, you're from Iran, what's your attitude to honor killings? You're from Pakistan, what's your attitude to honor killings? And if they say anything other than it's barbaric and I'm against it, they shouldn't be allowed entry into this country. I think we need to take a hard line on that. But we're so wrapped up in not wanting to offend people and being politically correct and assuming that multiculturalism equals tolerance. Actually, it doesn't. This is the thing. There's nothing tolerant about saying let's not look at these problems because we might offend someone or it might come across as bigoted, like we're generalizing. If you believe in human rights, you need to be angered by this. You need to be just think that poor young girl, horrible, absolutely horrible. She's not the first, and she won't be the last. It is one of the worst cases I've heard of, but there's other horrible cases as well. Young women being stoned to death. We know in Islamic jurisdictions, if a woman is raped, she will be accused of adultery under Islamic law. That's why apologists for Islam, like Mehdi Hassan, someone like him, he will, of course, he'll condemn this. But I actually believe that the apologists are in some ways worse than religious fanatics themselves. With religious fanatics, with hardliners, there's nothing mysterious about them. They are what they are. You know, this father who done this to his daughter, if you ask his views, it would be pretty clear cut. There'd be no mystery. He'd justify his actions. He would be clear cut. What I think's the real problem is the propagandists, those who say you can't criticize culture, you can't criticize religion. And like I say, this is I think probably a bit of both because it's a culture that's doing it. But it's a religion, it's a theocracy that is basically downplaying it, protecting it. I mean, I'm not overly hopeful that anything's going to change radically in Iran, because this has happened before, and you know, Iranian reformers expressed anger before. Remember, Iran's got about 80 million people, so of course there'll be many people in Iran who don't share those values. But the point is, there's also many who do, and it's the same principle with the blasphemy act laws in Pakistan. So when someone is brutally lynched for alleged blasphemy, the reformers and the liberals will say, "Oh, it's terrible. We're against it. This doesn't represent our country." Really, the problem I have with that sort of thinking is it's downplaying the extent of the problem, and it's downplaying the fact that there is genuine support for that sort of mentality. I mean, I'm sympathetic to anyone who wants to try and change that sort of religious thinking, but I'm not so sure that you can. I'm not sure that, and I certainly don't think the right approach is to shoot the messenger, i.e., Western media. It's absolutely right that the BBC covers it. It's absolutely right that other Western outlets cover it. And one could argue, actually, where there should be criticism of the likes of the BBC, they'll cover something like this when it happens in Iran, which is fine. I support that. But when it comes to Britain, they're a bit more mute because and I don't want to introduce a lot of other subjects because it might muddy the waters a little bit, but take the grooming gang scandal, for example. You know, it's very, very obvious that liberal media outlets were very reluctant to report the fact that it was British Pakistani men who were disproportionately involved in that. I saw one post by a liberal acquaintance of mine, and she put a rapist, no, what was it? A predator is just a predator. It's got nothing to do with race or religion. Yeah, true to an extent. You get white predators, you get Asian predators, but here's the thing I really, really think needs to be accepted. When you have something happening, when you have, for example, a situation that is being disproportionately committed by one group, then it's no good just saying, "Oh, well, it's just everyone's individuals," or don't generalize. Of course, don't generalize, but yeah, I don't think you can deal with a problem unless you recognize that there is a problem. And this can be extended to any circumstance if we look at the current situation in the United States. I don't think that that problem will be solved unless there is an acknowledgement that there is a problem with police brutality. So I'm a strong believer that where there are problems, they need to be candidly discussed. And no one should be in denial of things that their community is doing. So, just as an example to close off, as a white guy, I am not in denial about the existence of white racists and white neo-Nazi groups. So, British Pakistani people, instead of getting angry and saying, oh, they're being smeared because of the grooming gang thing, they need to acknowledge that this was something that was being disproportionately done by British Pakistani men. It doesn't mean that all British Pakistani men are guilty. Of course, it doesn't mean that. And that is an important point because then you get people who will treat them all as one and the same. If your attitude to a problem is to get defensive rather than acknowledge that there is a problem, then it doesn't help. Now, people might throw back at me, oh, but what about the white privilege thing? Because I've been very critical of that as a concept. The thing about that is it really is a universal generalization, and it is actually factually wrong. If, put it this way, if there really, really was a situation where all white people were privileged, I wouldn't deny it. I'd say, yeah, we need to acknowledge that. But I genuinely just don't think it is true. So basically, what I am driving at is honesty will always, 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 the truth will always, always, always trump sensitivities. It has to. Honor killings are barbaric. They're backward, they're primitive, and the people who do them are barbarians. And you know what? It isn't just men. Sometimes the women in these families are complicit. You hear these stories of mothers and grandmothers actually sometimes setting the situation up. So we shouldn't assume it's just men either. Sometimes women are just as complicit, and they are absolutely shameful. And whilst most of the victims are female, occasionally young men are also targeted. It's more rare, but it does happen. In fact, the film East is East, that was a good movie because it it touched on taboo issues. And in that film, actually, it's the young men that were being pressured into arranged marriages. And final point, people might say, oh, well, in Europe, you had arranged marriages in history. Yeah, we did, including right up to the Victorian period. But we have moved on. That's the point. If a society has regressive practices, then the society has to move on. It has to recognize this is not something that we can accept any longer. That's why in Britain in 2020, gay men are not stuck in the pillory because we've moved on. Societies move on. I contend that Islamic societies have a very long way to move on. And the evidence is there. If that makes me Islamophobic, so be it. It's just what is so apparently obvious. And I defy anyone to say that it's not the case. Show me one Islamic theocracy that respects minorities. Anyway, this is a bit longer than I intended, but I think there was a lot of points there that were important. It's just, I hope this young girl gets justice. I hope the father is not given 3 to 10 years. If Iran has a death penalty, I'm against the death penalty, broadly speaking. But if the death penalty is imposed in Iran for murder, this guy should get the death penalty. He should be hanged, just as any other murderer would be. That would be the appropriate uh, and fair sentence if it's to be evenly applied. I don't understand the logic of, let's say, two guys get into a street fight and one of them dies, and the guy that killed the other guy is hanged because he's a murderer. Okay, yet a father who brutally murders a defenseless young girl will only be given 3 to 10 years. Does that make any sense?